Well, it's such a pleasure to be joining you all. And, you know, first of all, I hope you all are keeping safe and in good spirits. It's really great to come together as a community when we are also facing challenges that affect us all. And I think, well, I'm just delighted to be part of this panel because in many ways, some of the information that my co-presenters have shared kind of build upon each other. And I also want to acknowledge the work of my colleague, Kai Ren from Shaanxi Normal University, who really took the lead in this ongoing research project that I will be sharing with all of you. And actually the title of our presentation, as you will see toward the end, is actually a quote from one of the interviews that we conducted. So even though the topic of LGBTQ students in the higher education context has been widely studied in Western contexts, certainly for many of us who are based in the United States, we are very fortunate in having a lot of literature and a lot of research to build upon. You know, today I'm wearing my Rainbow Center pin. Many of us also have resources on our own campus that support LGBTQ students and faculty and staff members, right? And we work with communities, but this is not a reality in many of the countries where we collaborate with, right? And that's certainly the context of China. So from this perspective, it really has been difficult to kind of develop this, or rather stitching together this patchwork of concepts and theories and literature, because we have a lot of research generated in the West, right? Generated in North America in particular. The United States has extensive literature on the topic, whereas for multiple reasons, including, of course, the fear of political persecution or just a general reservation to address concepts or ideas that may be controversial. Many of our colleagues in other countries, including China, may feel that these topics are controversial and therefore are addressed with some reservation, right? So the challenge in our research project, like the one I'm presenting, is building upon existing literature while also not imposing some of these concepts on a reality that is foreign to us, a reality that certainly is foreign to me, being both an insider and outsider researcher, right? So I identify as gay, cisgender, but also I'm aware that while I'm a transnational academic, I am very much based in the United States, and Western literature tends to inform the way I understand many of these topics, right? And conducting research in China then poses a particular challenge, and that's why collaboration is so important. So the first decision that we had to make, right, had to do with how are we going to address the topic, right? And I think for us, leaving the term Tongzhi untranslated was very important, right? So while the concept literally means common will, more loosely it can be translated as comrade. And it really was widely utilized, especially around the Chinese Revolution, as a way of acknowledging each other or referring to each other, right? So in a way, this term Tongzhi already represents a reappropriation of a concept, right? And also it is recognized, while there are other labels and other terms, it is the most widely utilized and importantly self-embraced indigenous label among same-sex romantically attracted people in China. Not only in China, but in Chinese cultures, right? So really this Tongzhi movement is what we could describe as a global movement, as well as some of our findings will be explaining in more detail. But But one of the challenges, right, in translating and in moving back and forth across these concepts is that we need to contextualize the study. And one of the important aspects in this research is that one of the characteristics that has marked the lived experiences of Tongzhi youth today is the fact that in China, homosexuality has been recently decriminalized, right? So most young Tongzhi, certainly those who are currently in university or college, have mostly grown up in a place or in an environment where homosexuality is no longer considered a crime, but it had been, right? So still a lot of the stigma and the generational gap exists, right? So many educators, as the findings of our study will show, feel very comfortable and free to share very negative remarks in class and otherwise. And you know, many of those remarks and stigma continue to be informed by the previous kind of concept of criminalization. In addition to that, some concepts that in the West we take for granted, such as the saliency of coming out, for instance, remain challenged in the Chinese context, right? So unlike their Western counterparts, many Chinese students see themselves first and foremost as part of a family unit, right? And that means that the notion of coming out is often seen as a confrontational political strategy that many of them don't feel comfortable deploying when it comes to their family. So they tend to rely more in building relationships and using existing relationships with their family members as a way to gain or earn acceptance. And that, of course, is a different framework than what we often take for granted, or certainly what the research in the West about LGBT college students may take for granted or assume. So we conducted a narrative inquiry study relying on snowball sampling. We had 6 research participants, and we intentionally conducted this study in a city that has a high number of universities, but that is not one of the large metropolises in Eastern China, right? So intentionally, we sought to conduct this study outside of Beijing and Shanghai, which tend to be overrepresented in the research, right? So that we could get just a different set of findings and experiences too. And the main data collection strategy that we used was in-depth interviews. They were conducted face-to-face because it is considered still a sensitive topic. We made sure that that we were in spaces where our participants felt comfortable and safe. So in some instances, we conducted the interviews in their homes or in spaces on campus or in neutral spaces where we could talk privately. The majority of the interviews were conducted in Chinese, even though in some of the participants felt comfortable enough in their English skills so that I was able to conduct some of the interviews in English, as I don't speak Chinese. So we had several themes that became salient in our research. In the interest of time in this presentation, I want to focus on the last 2, right? The negative university environments that participants faced, as well as the effects of these experiences on their academic life. But again, some of the connections for the discussion later on would be, as you can see, the very first finding in our study is that many of our participants were aware from very early on of you know, their identities or their emerging identities and feeling different as they were growing up. Right, and certainly one of the findings in our study was that in this heavily Confucian context, the opinions of others, particularly elders such as teachers, is very influential, right? And it can only determine not only how students see themselves, but also how other students perceive LGBT students, right? So in particular, we encountered examples where students who were bullied in school by their peers were nevertheless treated a bit better when teachers would, for instance, praise them in public because of being hardworking in their academics. So that was a very important theme and something that merits mentioning. And then I will conclude with some recommendations stemming from this study. So I have a quote here that I wanted to share. So I'll just be quiet for a moment so that you can read it. And as you can see, this quote is pointing right to the sense of isolation that many of our research participants encountered. Right? They felt that there weren't spaces where they could share these with others. And that generated a lot of challenges, right, for the research participants. And they really felt that in many ways that teachers, counselors, and others were actually making the situation worse for them. And of course, that is a significant challenge. As well, here is an example, right, of how some of these aggressions happen very publicly in classes. Right, and something that's really interesting from this quote is that it's coming from, so not only the student is telling us the story, but he's putting it in context as the interview is taking place. And as you can see in this quote, the context is a computer science class. Right, so this isn't a sociology or anthropology class. This isn't a human sexuality or psychology class. It is a computer science class, right? And then, so looking at some of the history of coding, and I think here we are able to see how also the faculty member editorializes, right, the conversation, and it really suggests how how in a way LGBT identified scholars really should be pitied, or so in a way some of the stigma becomes very salient. But also what's interesting to me is how empowered this faculty member feels in making these negative comments in class, right, in a course that isn't completely related to issues of sexuality or identity. But also, I think the message that we want to really emphasize here is the idea that the students that we encountered are very empowered, right? They don't see themselves either as victims or in any way kind of deficit perspective, right? So in this particular quote, as you can see, the research participant is indicating how while all these pressures and stigma exist and is very salient, they can also, the participants in our study, right, they're turning it into an opportunity to be better, right? And not only in terms of learning or academic, but in everything that they do. So in a way, there is this spirit of proving others wrong, right? And demonstrating that they are capable, strong, and resilient students, right? And that they themselves can really, as long as they're left alone, right? Like in some of our students were skeptical about the possibility, of course, of, in other words, some of them said, we don't want to be treated differently. We just want the stigma to stop, right? And I thought that that was an important message, right? And one of our students, right, so rather than using our own recommendations, I wanted to read a different quote from one of the research participants who said, since the university is a place to teach and educate people, it is also good to start related courses like sex education. This should be included. This should be also including the topic of homosexuality, right? So as you can see, it really, in a way, the participants that we interviewed tend to have relatively a low bar about what their expectations are. In other words, they don't want to be treated differently. They simply want to be given the same opportunities that their peers received. I also want to be mindful of time. So
you have about 5 minutes, Gerardo.
That sounds great. Thank you. And so really, I actually would like to leave it here because I'm looking at some of the different questions, and I actually would like to give back those 4 minutes or so left so that we can have a very active discussion. There were 2 very interesting papers before mine, and I really think we can turn it over to the Q&A.